Okay, so let's go. The first part of today's class, if you will, which is going to go probably an hour, hour and 15, 20 minutes, something like that. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we measure the performance of regions. And much of what I'm going to talk about could be found within the one article that I had asked you to read, if you so chose to read it, the Michael Porter's article on the economic performance of regions. And you see the general topics that we're going to be covering would be, let's say, some facts about regional performance, what we really mean by a performing region versus a non-performing region, I suppose, as well as the composition of various regional economies, the components, what makes up a region. We talked a lot over the last couple of weeks when Dr. Bajanbak was outlining his matrix of input-output models. He talked about forming an economic base as a way of understanding the concept of clustering. So we're going to talk a little bit about clusters as well in this class, and we're going to talk more specifically to the role of clusters. Afterwards, we will talk a little bit more about the direct competitiveness, perhaps as seen in the literature, with respect to economic regions. So let's just continue here. Let's talk about what the performance is. How do we measure the performance of a particular region? There are a number of ways, as you might have extracted out of your reading, those of you who did read the Porter article. One of the categories, major categories, would be wages. We can take a look at the wages that are paid within that region across the various occupations. Now, when we're looking at the performance of wages within a region, there are two general categories that we focus our attention on. One, of course, would be wage inequality. Wage inequality, the difference between the lowest wages, let's say, paid by occupation to the relatively highest wages. And when we're talking about the wages, we're really talking about the entire wage bill. I want to make sure we understand that. Too many of us think of wages as simply the hourly rate we have to pay our employees. But those of us who have business, those of you who have businesses, understand that the entire wage bill very often is much more than that. We pay benefits and other perks to our employees, so we kind of have to adjust for that. Wage inequality is one way of judging the performance. And one of the interesting things that we have found in the paper written for us by Porter is that we see very little correlation between the lowest wages and highest wages paid across regions. In other words, there's very little difference between the ranges across the regions that he had studied in that particular paper. And we'll talk more about that as we take a look at some other slides and some other performance issues, and of course, especially as we work with clusters. Another performance metric, if you will, with wages would be wage mobility, and this is probably a little bit more important. How is it that that the wages change? How likely is it that you, let's say, David, you start at a particular wage in a particular area? What is your ability to actually increase those wages over a period of time? Be able to do it not necessarily in the same occupation, but maybe change occupations to where you could cross-train and perhaps accelerate your the wages paid to you during that time. And it's not just upward mobility, by the way, it's also downward mobility. What's the ability of a region to absorb, let's say, a recessionary period where firms may leave, firms may downsize? What's the ability of you getting a job, not necessarily at the same strata that you were before, but perhaps one or two levels lower? So mobility works in both directions, and that doesn't just work upwardly. The second major category with respect to wages would be wage growth. And this is what I started to say before. I kind of jumped the gun. I said wage growth is not necessarily, we found evidence, not necessarily determined by what the starting wages are. Starting wages could be relatively high, and wage growth ratios could actually rise at about the same rate as those regions where this average starting wage is low. And again, we'll talk more about that as we take a look at the specific output models, if you will, from the Porter article. Thirdly, employment growth. Here we go. How does a region encourage the growth of employment? And this growth of employment is not only, the number of jobs that has increased. It is also the quality of the jobs. It encompasses the wages that are paid in those particular professions. The quality of work life, if you will. Working conditions also play an important role in understanding the measurement of employment growth. Well, we did find out, what Porter found is that there really is a weak relationship to starting employment size. Some regions have grown their employment levels extremely high, even though initially they have high levels of employment as it is. And so there's very little correlation. So you can't go into a region, for example, that has a high unemployment level and then say, oh, well, if we only brought in this industry, the employment growth rate is going to shoot astronomically or exponentially. It doesn't work that way all the time. Very weak correlations across the country with respect to that employment growth and determinants and drivers of that employment growth. Finally, one of the interesting things that Porter brought out, and I find extremely interesting and extremely powerful driver in regional economic performance, and that is the incidence of what we call innovation. The incidence of innovation, new products. He talks about patenting. How many patents per capita in a particular region as a driver in the performance of a particular region. So these are the major performance metrics and variables that we try to take a look at when we are judging the performance of a particular region. Next thing we want to do, and what Porter had done, is attempt to compose what makes up the composition of a particular region, the industrial base of a region. And we can see that he breaks it down into three general industrialized categories. One would be traded industries, two would be local industries, and then three would be what we call resource-dependent industries. Traded, local, and resource-dependent. Let's start with traded. Traded industries is kind of, it's kind of what we want in a particular region. Even though we're not going to, refuse the others, but traded industries is kind of what we want. They're not generally resource dependent, and here's the point. These industries are the ones that will export their product. And we talked about, in this class, we talked about exports out of a particular region over the last couple of classes, correct? We export. If we export, that acts as a net injection into our region. Ironically, I just talked about leakages and injections in two of my classes today to my undergrads. And I could not stress any more the importance of understanding this concept of leakages and injections. An injection actually increases the economic well-being of a particular area. I was talking earlier today about countries. Here we're talking about regions. A traded industry is one that is based in our region for reasons